Dr. Manjushree Sen, and to ISIS for having me here. It's a real pleasure. Is this well placed? Is this okay? So Nepal isn't one of the world's large countries. It's considerably dwarfed by its neighbors. And it doesn't get much attention globally, so it's always great to come to an event like this. Nepal's interaction with the rest of the world is actually very extensive. Migration became a very central part of Nepali identity after 1816, the war with the British, which started Gurkha recruitment. So there was a Gurkha presence in Britain and India, in Singapore. The large Nepali population in Singapore attests to this. And especially over the last 20 years, as Nepal has opened and democratized and become part of the global economy, economic migration has become a real fact of Nepali life. So conservative estimates are that there are 3 to 4 million Nepalis in a country of about 27 million who are working abroad. And financially, they really keep the country afloat. It's become, to a very large extent, a remittance economy. So even though there are a lot of Nepalis all over the world now, and you can go almost anywhere and run into Nepalis, it doesn't have, Nepal as a nation doesn't have much of an impact in the world. It sort of goes through everything that it's going through in a very quiet way, very inward way. And it does everything that it's doing in relative obscurity. The writers of the country also write in relative obscurity. If you compare it to, writers from India and Pakistan now is getting a lot of attention. We're waiting for the census data to really come out, but there are around 100 languages in Nepal. It's got a lot of diversity. Some of these languages are very well developed, have a large sort of written tradition. Some are really just have a lot of oral literature and aren't very well developed in terms of scripts or publishing. Nepali is the dominant language, and literature in Nepal has a very esteemed place. Writers are considered very much part of the intelligentsia. They're considered to have refined thoughts that they can, then pronounce on matters of public interest. But literature itself isn't read very much. The publishing industry is fairly disorganized, and so just little things like distribution publishing are very disorganized. So the usual print run for a book might be 5,000 books in a country of 27 million, which is a mid-sized country. And the influence of Nepali as a language is limited outside of Nepal. So in India's northeast, you'll get the Nepali areas, and those are also very vibrant in terms of literary production. Darjeeling and Kalimpong and all of that. And now there are a lot of Nepali expatriate organizations abroad which are helping to promote Nepali literature. But again, the sphere of influence is very limited. In terms of writing, translation is something that worldwide, I think there's some really dismal statistic, like 3% of the world's literature is translated into English. In Nepal, it's much worse than that because there isn't much translation happening. And English writing in Nepal is very rare. So it really only, because we were not colonized and we didn't have the English sort of education system that, for example, India has. And so it's really only in the new millennium that English writers have been fluent enough to come up and be published internationally. And I'm talking here only of literature. So it's really only after 2000. And even then, it's been very little. Until about a few years ago, it was really just one other writer and me, which really doesn't end up being much of a literary scene. I mean, to have a really vibrant literary scene of the kind that you would have, let's say, in Delhi, you need schools of thought, styles, arguments between them. You need rivalries. You need all of that. And even now in Nepal, there are maybe 4 or 5 English writers, and they're all friends, and we all get along. And there's hardly a scene, So for me, even though I write in English, my community is really with the Nepali writers. I really consider myself part of that tradition and part of that community. I've written 3 books of fiction now, and they tend to involve, have political themes or have politics with a big P or a small p in them. In most of these books. And in a way, the subject of politics has really come to me just because it's sort of in the air that we breathe in Kathmandu, it's in the water that we drink, it's going through a very, very political time. I'm part of the 1990 generation in Nepal. We've had a political a movement for democracy for pretty much, it started right after World War I with the Gurkhas who fought in World War I, seeing the rest of the world and having this political awakening, coming back to Nepal and demanding changes there that coalesced into a democracy movement. So about 3 years after India gained its independence, Nepal had its first democratic movement and became a democratic country. It didn't last. 10 years later, 1960, the king took over. It was always an autocratic system. The king took over and reinstituted the autocratic system. It took 30 years for us to get democracy back again in 1990. And by that time, the demand for liberal and progressive values was so great that it almost became uncontainable. That after that, 6 years in, we started a Maoist revolution or a Maoist war. The state responded very badly with a very sort of atrocity-ridden counterinsurgency. The royal family, which at this point had only constitutional powers, imploded with a sort of massacre at the palace that basically took out most of the royal family. And then the king who came in decided to take over in 2005 and reinstitute an absolute monarchy. So it's been a really turbulent period. It didn't succeed. In 2006, we had the third democracy movement. And in this one, the Maoists were part of it along with the democratic political parties. So since then, in 2008, we abolished the monarchy, which seemed to have consistently been holding the country back from democracy. And so since 2008, we've been in the process of trying to draft a new constitution, so far unsuccessfully. There's a very bitter struggle going on about whether this constitution is going to be more progressive in its leaning or more democratic or liberal in its leaning. So that issue hasn't been resolved, and so we're still in a way waiting for this revolution that started all those years ago to come to completion. Now, I'm part of the 1990 generation. I was just through with college in the United States when I was in Nepal at that time, and Nepal rode this wave of democratization that swept through Europe after the fall of the Soviet Union and the Berlin Wall. So suddenly, this polity that had been closed, I had grown up in a Nepal where censorship was practiced very strongly. This sort of fabrication of national identity was a very large national agenda. There were a lot of untruths and propaganda in our understanding of ourselves and of the state. And suddenly in 1990, Nepal had freedom, so everything, it was a very optimistic time. It seemed like everything was going to change, and all of these rights, we had always thought of ourselves as the subjects of our kings, and suddenly we were citizens. And so all of these universal rights that were available to citizens of, let's say, India, were going to be ours too. I voted for the first time in my life in 1991, and that experience, which is the experience of exercising your freedom and your choice, really, it moved me very deeply, and it really changed me. And I think something really palpable happens in your understanding of yourself as a person when you become enfranchised. And so it affected me so much so that I had actually thought that I was not going to live in Nepal. I was just in Nepal for a break between undergraduate and graduate studies, and I ended up living there pretty much for all of my adult life, except for the last couple of years. So it really sort of became part of my life to sort of be part of this changing society. There was a kind of optimism and innocence in 1990 that I think is very much part of my work. At that time, none of us really realized that 1990 was the beginning of the process of democratization, and that there were going to be so many hurdles and so many setbacks and so many steps backwards, either because of the monarchy or because of the Maoist war or the counterinsurgency. We just didn't realize that there was going to be so much stalling and so much stagnation, because when you think of a revolution, you sort of think in terms of a big sweep of history, and it all feels like it's going to be very dramatic. And actually, so much of Nepali life is characterized by just waiting for some political movement, which is, and something to happen. Like right now, we're waiting for the constitution to be made, and all of us are helpless. We're just waiting for it to be made. We didn't realize at that time that it was going to be like that. We thought it was going to be a much more sort of optimistic period of nation building, and we'd really get on with things, and the country would be prosperous. And of course, the Singapore model is something that, even though it's completely irrelevant to Nepal, is much touted. So, now more than 20 years back, when I look back at, I see that I've spent almost my entire adult life in a society in complete turmoil. A society that's constantly in the process of becoming democratic, but also in the process of unbecoming democratic and just falling apart. And all of the anxieties that accompany the process of becoming and unbecoming have been there. The insecurities and the violence and the conflict and the constant renegotiation between people is part of Nepali life. So the hopes, that were raised in 1990 just have been dashed again and again, and raised again and again, and dashed again and again, and it's just part of the cycle of life there now. So my writing really reflects this cycle of hope, of hope and despair, and disillusionment. The first novel I wrote is the one that deals the most directly with politics. It's called The Tutor of History, and it's set at the time of a general election. I mentioned that I had, voted for the first time in 1991. By the time I wrote this, I had observed 2 elections from fairly close up, and I had seen the kind of problems that elections in our part of the world have, which is gerrymandering is very common to begin with, and then there's influence peddling and vote buying, booth capturing, vote rigging, intimidation, violence. There's a lot of different forms of sort of skewing the elections. So this is some of the usual challenges that new and inexperienced democracies, and sometimes even old and experienced democracies, seem to face. So in the novel, I wanted to explore the issue of freedom and the limits on it politically as imposed by an election that's rigged. So the culmination point of the story takes place on voting day, and it's funny because when the book came out, it was 2001, and we haven't had elections since 1996, basically. And so by the time the book came out, it was already, there was no longer any system of voting in Nepal. Everything had been reversed by the war or disabled by the war, the Maoist insurgency. So in 2008, when we had our most recent election, a friend in the UN said that he was reading the novel in order to try and find out what elections in Nepal used to be like, because there was no memory of it among the Nepal experts who come in and out, and all of that. So he said it actually read like a bit of a manual on how to rig elections. So it wasn't really what I had set out to do, but it was something I was glad to be able to do, to be able to hold a mirror to the sort of failed politics of 1990, a democracy that's flawed as we were practicing it then. So politics as a subject was very central in the novel, but it mattered to me only insofar as it had an impact on people. Of course, it's not just politics for the sake of politics. So I wanted to look at the issue of freedom also, not just in politics, but also in terms of people's personal lives. And, in people's lives take place, of course, in a very specific cultural context. And one thing that's made the transition to democracy really difficult in Nepal, and I believe this very strongly, is that the cultural values of Hinduism as practiced in Nepal are extremely hierarchical and is very, very comfortable with inequality. So the inequality between the genders, the inequality between the castes, between ethnic groups, people who are inside the caste system and outside the caste system, all of that, I believe, is very anti-democratic values are at the core of Nepali culture as it had been set over the period before 1990. And so, and you know, Hinduism, only in 2006 did we become a secular country. Before that, we were, you know, very proud of the fact that we were the only Hindu kingdom in the world, and Hinduism was the official state language and something that was really supported by the state. And so I think that that's really held us back in a lot of ways. The protagonists of this novel end up, you know, living out their lives in that cultural milieu where inequality is just a part of life. And one protagonist, who's a widow, she lives in a very sort of circumscribed life of the Hindu widow. You know, you're not allowed to wear colorful clothes, you're not allowed to express desire, all kinds of pleasure are taboo, and sexual pleasure is particularly forbidden. And there's another protagonist who's a young and disillusioned communist who falls in love with her, and at that point when she falls in love with him too, she has to sort of see, you know, whether she can break out of this sort of the cultural dictates of Hinduism as set around her. So for me, the search for personal freedom in the novel is just as important as the search for political freedom. The limits on personal freedom through the culture I believe, are as sharp an affront as the limits to political freedom through rigged elections. Because fiction, you know, to write fiction is to be concerned overall with the individual, with the person, and not with ideas. I mean, I consider myself a writer of ideas. My work is led more by the themes that I'm interested in. So I'm interested in politics as a theme, but it only matters insofar as you can look at it through the lens of one particular individual that you're writing about. And this is, strangely, it's harder than it sounds, because what you write about becomes, or the person you write about becomes a very difficult choice in the middle of a society that's in the middle of a revolution. I like to write about ordinary people, not about freedom fighters and heroes and people, you know, who are obviously the oppressors and the oppressed. And I'd really rather write about the anti-hero and the small person who's living out their small life than about someone who, you know, does something really brave and changes all of society. But when you're from a society like Nepal, which has the need for heroes and which is sort of a hunger for, has this hunger for big, you know, heroic figures, it's quite difficult to pay attention to ordinary people, and even more so to care about them enough to write about them. So, you know, how do you choose one particular ordinary person to write about when, you know, everyone, all these ordinary people are going through such difficulty, and then there are a few extraordinary people around. It becomes a real choice. Why not, you know, as bad as the widow that I wrote about, as bad as her situation is, there are always women who are in a much worse situation. Things like trafficking and, you know, all kinds of oppression take place. Other women have it much worse. Why am I not writing about them? Why do I want to write about this one particularly unremarkable person whose small act of defiance is very tiny? It doesn't change much. It just changes her life. So I have to overcome my own doubt about the value of ordinary people. You know, should I write about extraordinary heroes? Should I create the ideal rather than the normal, the real, you know? I also have to overcome the space given to writers from the third world. There's something that happens to people, writers like me, is we try, publishers and agents and everyone in the literary industry tries to channel you into writing about extreme forms of oppression, extreme suffering, extreme, you know, acts of drama or heroism or color or spice. So there's a very, very limited space to write just about ordinary people like you and me, the middle class, unremarkable person. There's very little space for that. People really want to hear, you know, they want to see a protagonist suffer the absolute extremes that they could be suffering and overcome that in some heroic way. Something that, a kind of pigeonholing that the publishing industry likes to do. For me, it's really important to resist that, to establish the universality of humanity by writing about just very ordinary people. And so after I've made that what is to me a fairly difficult choice. I have to remember that I can't just write about ordinary people. I have to do it in such a way that individuates that person and makes them very complicated, full of contradictions, and utterly human. You know, in this I've sort of pulled on two traditions. One is, as I said earlier, I really feel like I'm very much part of the literary tradition of Nepal, where political writing is fairly common. As in the rest of South Asia, Nepali writers are expected to speak on behalf of those who are voiceless. Some writers in Nepal speak up in a liberal tradition, and others speak up in a more progressive and even revolutionary tradition, sort of making a call for change. That's in their literature. Outside of their writing, also, writers are expected to be politically active. And it's been interesting, all three democracy movements in Nepal have had writers and artists, but particularly writers at the forefront. And just in the last one, you know, in 2005, after the king took over for the last time, the poets of Nepal were the first people, you know, there was a ban on the right to assembly, as with a lot of other basic rights had been denied. So they were the first ones to challenge the ban on free assembly by holding public poetry readings. And every time they did a public poetry reading, the police would charge, and, you know, there would be sort of mayhem. And this image of the state attacking poets became so laughable that it made the state look so ridiculous that the state had to give up attacking the poets. You know, so once that stopped and the poets were able to start having public poetry readings, then other members of civil society joined in, and they became protests and became larger and larger gatherings. And so this very important right to assembly was brought back through writers. So that kind of direct action is also something that Nepali writers are expected to take part in, and also, you know, activism through their writing, through the content of what they're writing. They're expected to sort of use their voice towards moral and ethical ends, and to use literature to argue for reform and sometimes for revolution. So in Nepal, you know, there's been a very large growth in progressive writing in particular, and this is something that Nepal has, the influence has come in both from India and also from China. So social realist writers like Mahasukha Devi, or the Chinese revolutionary writers like Lu Xun have really had a big impact on Nepali literature from the progressive tradition. And I feel like I write very much from that tradition. But I also learned a really important lesson from the American literary canon, and I was schooled in America. In political literature, you often come across the problem of stereotyping and predictability. You know, there's the oppressor, there's the oppressed, there's a formula that the story follows to, you know, show the oppressed rising up and sort of overcoming their oppression. It can be rousing, this kind of literature, but it can also often read as very sort of formulaic and flat and mechanistic. And you see this a lot in political writing everywhere, not just in South Asia. You see it a lot in Latin America, you see it in Africa, you see it in places where there is a lot of political writing. The powerless Hindu widow is a stereotype that you come by often in South Asian writing and Nepali writing, which is exactly why I wanted to write about it. I wanted to take on exactly this problem of the stereotype in terms of how do you write about a South Asian widow who is experiencing all this oppression, but in a way that humanizes her completely. And that became very important to me because in a sort of conservative culture such as Nepal's, individual subjectivity is always obscured by identities that are imposed on us externally. So I don't know the extent to which you can do this in Singapore, but in Nepal it's very easy when we just look at someone to place them socially. You can tell pretty much what their caste may be. You can approximate very closely their class, their caste, their identity group, their place in society. So there's a structure, a hierarchy, and you can kind of place that person exactly where they belong. And so some people are higher men or higher caste people, or urban people are higher up in the hierarchy, and women, low caste, rural people are lower down. So we see each other already as stereotypes to a large extent. And so there's something very dehumanizing about this, where we look at the other as something very separate from the self. And fiction is precisely about undoing dehumanization. political fiction, therefore, that depicts characters in a stereotypical way, even when it's very well meant, when it's calling for, all of the ethically, correct things that we want. Even when it's well meant, it's very counterproductive because it's repeating exactly the kind of stereotyping that society is already imposing upon people. So when I wrote about this widow, I really wanted to humanize her, not just by giving her a sort of rich inner life, but by giving her hard edges and prickly bits and failure and ambivalence and contradiction. I wanted to make her sort of human, just full of imperfect and human and uniquely her, and not just any widow. And in this I was influenced by contemporary American literature. A lot of American literature, I went to one of these creative writing programs in the United States where you spend a couple of years just learning how to write. And I found it very interesting because a lot of my American colleagues' response, I had started the tutor of history by then, and a lot of their response to it was, is this a type or an individual? Because as soon as you say this woman is a Hindu widow, then you have to struggle against that stereotype to really humanize her. And so the challenge that they kept throwing to me was, is this a type or an individual? Is this one specific person you're writing about, or are you writing about a kind of person that exists in Nepali society? Which was always a very difficult thing for me to answer. My question to my American colleagues, there's such a focus on the inner life in a lot of American fiction. You would never know what else is going on in American society. You're sort of seeing this person's life, you're seeing their conflict either with their family or their parents or their loved ones or their lover or whoever the central conflict is taking place with, and you don't see the larger society. So my question to them was always, what's happening around these characters? So we all have issues with our parents or our lovers or all of that. We all have that. Isn't there anything else going on in their life? Is there a war going on in the background? Is there, what else is America getting up to? It felt very skewed to me. The ratio of the inner life to the outer life felt really skewed to me. And it felt a lot like navel gazing, where you write endlessly about the inner life. As I struggled with this issue and the two traditions, it led me in a way to a meeting of Marx and Freud, or post-Marxianism and post-Freudianism, because it really became the issue that for me, I believe that people's characters are formed to a certain degree by the situation that they're in and the society around them, but they also have this freedom to act and to choose and to be a certain way, which comes from the American sort of intense focus on the psychological and the inner world. So I found that it was really important for me to find a meeting place between these two philosophies, these two political positions or stands. And as I worked on the novel, I came to seek out a balance between these two. This balance, I think, basically reaches us to the truth of fiction writing, because fiction writing, it is the task of fiction writing is to humanize. You humanize the characters that you write about, but you also humanize the reader. And obviously for the writer, you humanize yourself as you write, or remember that you are human. Fiction basically takes readers out of their own life and puts them into the lives of others who they might not necessarily be interested in. It's about engendering empathy for others that we're culturally trained not to think of as similar to us. Either they're higher or lower or different than us, they're the other. It teaches us to blur the boundary between self and the other, and it makes us able to imagine the other and to identify with the other. So we begin to see ourselves as kindred spirits, and also we begin to see ourselves as equal and of equal value. This, I think, has far-reaching consequences in a society such as Nepal, where inequality is so much a part of the culture. So if we're searching for democracy politically, but we're also searching for democratic values to come into our culture, I think fiction becomes a tool by which we are able to imagine each other's lives and to value each other's lives and to really see equality among us. So in that way, I think fiction, basically, the task of fiction is to change consciousness in terms of the consciousness of the individual reader, and then the larger consciousness in terms of how people think.